Yes, yeah. Yes, yeah. Yes, yeah. Yes, yeah. Yes, yeah. Governments and people have something in common. Yes, yeah.
As I said, most of the people who look to African socialism look to varieties of Stalinism or Maoism. When you saw the collapse of Eastern Europe, when you saw the Maoist countries turning away from any idea that they were actually building communism and saying, oh, socialism is better at building capitalism than yours is, then there's no incentive for people just to keep on calling themselves socialists on that basis. So people will look to other places for their inspiration. And I think the most amazing thing is, if you look at the time, people talk about in the 80s, most of Africa was run by dictators. Now most of it is these democracies. If you look at how the change came, in lots of countries the changes came by methods we would recognise as socialist. It came by trade union movements, it came by general strikes, it came by people pushing aside the existing regimes, or in the case of the NDC in Zimbabwe, failing to push aside them. But the most shocking thing about this is that the people who came to lead these, even if they were trade union leaders, didn't look to some kind of leftism, they didn't look to Marxist revolution. What they looked to was some American idea, probably most closely affected the sort of colour revolutions, this idea that you come out on the streets, you stand about for a bit, you probably don't have a strike, strike's a bit radical, but you organise and then things will change and then we'll have democracy and everything will be all right. And you can see the attraction of this idea, particularly when it seemed to work in a few countries, but actually it doesn't work and it doesn't deliver because you end up with variations of the same people being in charge. And you end up, most importantly, with capitalism still being in charge. You haven't even challenged things to the extent when the people in the 60s took power, they went to make radical changes. What's happening now is no radical changes are made. All people say is we will introduce good governance, we will introduce an end to corruption. But if you don't get rid of the corrupting influence, which is capitalism itself, you won't actually be able to get rid of this. And I think that, just to conclude on, I didn't plot the slide, there's another slide I wanted to show of South African construction workers on strike around building all the stuff for the World Cup that's been going on this year, just to remind people to a more positive note, having talked about negatively about that there are still inspiring strikes going on around Africa. But I do think that it's a matter of what people believe in and the kind of leadership that's being offered. Africa is being hit by, we think we're being hit hard by the international recession. Things are worse in Africa. There are worse attacks going on. And the need to look to ways of fighting back. The most inspiring place to fight, whether it's been a fight back going on recently, I think is Egypt. It's always forget he's actually in Africa, it's not sub-Saharan Africa, where there have been mass strikes and people actually fighting back and starting to get the kind of organisation you need to start rebuilding the kind of solid socialist movement that's needed. But people can also look to Greece and start seeing the kinds of action that's needed. And I just think there is this great tradition of people actually looking to Africa for inspiration. And so I think that if we actually start seeing African groups fighting back, which I believe we will see, that kind of inspiration can come again. Now, it's interesting if you read about Malcolm X, that when he was organising in America, he was inspired by people like Nasser, by Sekou Touré in Guinea, maybe surprisingly because of what happened later by Kenneth Kaunda and people like that. And I think that Africa, as it makes its own history, starts inspiring people. There's one last slide I can't particularly like. The Rasta movement took up wearing dreadlocks because it was inspired by these are Bama guerrillas from Kenya in the 1950s. As they fought in the forests, they grew their hair in dreadlocks. It was seeing their resistance that inspired the Rastas to start growing dreadlocks. What I want to see is this kind of influence of people taking lessons from revolutionaries, hopefully African revolutionaries. It's good to take lessons in hairstyles, but I think it's more important if people can take lessons in how you need working class organisation to actually change society and how it is possible to see socialist revolution across Africa.
I think the problem in Africa, okay, on one part I agree with you, imperialism is still a problem. actually I would call it neocolonialism, because you still have companies like the BS, for instance, still manipulating power. We had a guy who was chief executive of the BS, actually being the de facto president of my country. If you wanted to find out if you were in cabinet, you would hear from him, and if you are not, you still hear from him. He was the de facto president. Actually, there was a case that came up in the US, and the guy was implicated in my country. So what has happened is that these countries still rule Africa through these companies, right? They collaborate with our political leaders. So that is what is taking place. So I would argue that yes, the imperial legacy is still there, but we also still have our own people who are collaborating. So in a sense, you have a situation of poor ethical leadership. So I think the problem in Africa is poor ethical leadership. We have our own people who are replacing the colonial masters, but they're still replicating their way of doing things. That is why a country like Zimbabwe still have the old laws which were used by apartheid, by the settler regime, still being used by Mugabe. It's not only Zimbabwe, it's happening in other African countries as well. And then now coming to the working class. I think the problem that I have with the working class is that the working class hardly ever provides its own leadership. Even if you take the example of South Africa, it was led by people like Mandela, who are the elites, people like Cyril Ramaphosa. So they do not have capacity to have their own, they can be organized, but they do not have capacity to have their own leaders emerging from within their ranks. They are often led by the middle class, and as a result, the revolution is often hidden. And lastly, on the question of Marxism, you know, as you rightly said, the brand of Marxism which Africa has been associated with is a Russian kind and the Mao kind of politics, which has been discredited. So when you talk about Marxism, people really are turned off. They look askance at you because of the history that we have. That's the problem. Thank you.
If it's possible with a socialist revolution in Africa, but it's a question of when. And if you see the imperialists and the World Trade Organization, the IMF, and also want to add in these particular times with the World Cup in South Africa, the FIFA is one of the bastards too. They're taking all of the money from this tournament in South Africa. It's a shame.
And the history of the working class in Nigeria recently, I think, is very, very inspiring. In 2008, when there was the last general strike, they had three main demands. One is that the increase in the VAT, which had been implemented, should be reversed. They won that. The second demand was that the fuel price increases should be reversed, and they won most of that. The third demand was that there should be a reversal of the privatisation of, I think, an oil refinery, and they won that. So, you know, for me, it's coming from Britain, where the last and only general strike was two things. Is there an organised working class? I think that demonstrates clearly there is in the vast majority of African countries. The other thing is that we're trying to do, obviously with Marxism and so on, is actually building an organised socialist opposition.
And what we are doing today at Marxism in London in 2010 are working to develop those ideas. We're asking people to help us do that here, so we can do that as communists do it across the world in different places. Sometimes it's easier for us here than it will be for us when we're in parts of Africa. We would urge you now to help us form and build part of that movement across the world. So the answer to this will not only be yes, there can be, but yes, there will be.
Yes, yeah. Governments and people have something in common.